Welcome to this edition of African Perspective, the leading video blog on African affairs. Really excited to have you. And today we're going to do a book review of the book Digital Democracy, Analog Politics by Nanjala Nyabola, Kenyan author. Really excited to talk about this book, so let's get started. So I'm really excited to talk about this book, Digital Democracy, Analog Politics by Nanjala Nyabola, how the internet era is transforming politics in Kenya. I've read this book a couple of times, front to back. It's compelling, it's informative, and I'll tell you all about the contents of it and what I observed in it. But I'm also a big fan of the author. She's called Nanjala Nyabola. She's a political commentator on Kenyan and African affairs with a focus on technology. And I think she thinks I'm a bit of a groupie by now because I've gone to all her talks, and I also got this book signed by her. So yeah, I'm definitely a super fan. But it's wonderful to have kind of a different voice talking about politics in Kenya. And I'll talk more about that dynamic as this goes along. But essentially, this is just a book that talks about the conflict that has come more recently with technology and social media. We talk about platforms such as Facebook, WhatsApp. How has that influenced the nature of our democracies and our politics around the world? And of course, she's using Kenya as the point of reference, her homeland. So I think to me it was something really powerful. So I'm really excited to talk about this book. So here are 4 things that I found particularly poignant and particularly interesting about this book. So let's have a look at that. So one of the things that remarked me about this book was the fact that it was written by a Kenyan, an African who grew up here. And I know that sounds mundane, or that may sound kind of obvious. But one thing that is unfortunate about when you talk about African affairs, when you talk about knowledge production and books that are written on Africa, unfortunately the people who dominate discussions, debates around literature around African affairs are not from Africa. For example, this is a book that is published by, I think it's Z Books, but in conjunction with African Arguments, and they have released a number of titles such as AIDS and Power, the United States in Africa, China in Africa, Britain in Africa, A People's Story of Burundi, Climate Change in Africa, a number of issues touching the African continent. But when you see the names, I think there are about maybe 20 to 30 titles that are published here, and it was only about 2 or 3 African names that I saw on here. And that just shows that even when you talk about academia and we talk about knowledge dissemination around the African continent, we need more voices such as Nanjala Nyabola's one. And it's so refreshing really to see that. So that's why it may sound mundane to say that yes, this was written by a Kenyan and African, but in reality, it's unfortunately not so common. So when you go along the same lines about her positionality and her identity as a Kenyan, I think it changes the way in which she wrote the book. And what I mean by that is that on a personal level, I felt like I was being spoken to, rather than trying to, having trouble to identify myself with this literature. One thing that she also decries in the book, or she kind of points out, is the fact that it's so hard when looking at literature around Africa that's written in some of the top universities from outside the continent. When you talk about Oxford or Harvard, it's very hard to situate yourself or identify yourself with that. And for me, I was able to do that in this book. There's one analogy she talks about going to the central business district. And in Kenya, especially in Nairobi, going to the central business district is somewhat of a ritual. It's a big deal. Like when you tell someone, naenda tao, I'm going to town. It's a big deal. You have to dress up. You have to kind of look the part. So going to town is something of a sacred ritual for a lot of people. There's a certain mystique about going to town. And she argues that this is part of the legacy of colonialism, where there's a separation between your physical and intellectual environment. There was such a separation that still exists today that perhaps doesn't exist in perhaps in our eyes European or Western countries or Western cities for that matter. So it's a very interesting kind of phenomena that perhaps would be more poignant or more striking for someone who has lived here than someone who had never really lived that experience. So I think that was just one example, one of many examples where she was talking about how even fundraising in Kenya. We have something called Harambe, where people come together and put money together to be able to perhaps support someone's education or to support someone's health fund. And technology has definitely changed the way in which people do that. Someone will just add you on WhatsApp and say, oh, by the way, I have a wedding, please. I'll just add you on WhatsApp without your consent. And they say, oh, you have to contribute 5,000 shillings for my wedding or something of that sort. And it's been a running joke. But in reality, technology has really changed those dynamics. And I think those dynamics she's privy to, even as a Kenyan who's grown up here, makes it so powerful and so poignant. So I think that's one thing I did appreciate from this. And also when you think about it, it was written to Kenyans. I feel like it spoke to me personally. I think that I was able to resonate or kind of empathize with some of what she was saying. And I think that's why a lot of Kenyans, I remember talking to her, and she said she was surprised by how many Kenyans have come out to purchase this book. And she shouldn't be surprised because we feel spoken. The second thing that I also observed that was very powerful in this book was the fact that I think the first time we have a case study that is Kenya that is at the center of a global phenomenon. Usually when you talk about Africa with regard to, issues such as, say, terrorism or global trade, we usually find ourselves in the margins of the conversation. And even in this conversation around, social media and politics and democracy, people always talk about, the Brexit vote, where we saw, the way the internet, altered the way people voted in the Brexit vote. And you also hear about, things about Trump. There's a wonderful documentary that I think is on Netflix talking about the Great Hack. But usually you don't really hear, what's happening in perhaps, Trinidad and Tobago, or what's happening in Kenya, or what's happening in South Africa with regard to that dynamic. So it was really refreshing to see that Kenya was at the center of this. And when she talks about the issue around, Cambridge Analytica, Kenya was actually one of the testing hubs really for Cambridge Analytica before they implemented it in the United States with the Trump election in 2016 or the Brexit vote as well. So these dynamics really give nuance and give a sense of agency to Africans. Usually it's just like, oh, Africa is affected, or, even when we talk about technology in Kenya, the conversation is so shallow usually, or reductive, or, people talk about, I think Kenya's even tired of people talking about M-Pesa and how, it's a wonderful success and it's incredible. But there needs to be more nuanced conversations about it. And she also gives some really compelling reasons as to why M-Pesa worked in Kenya and perhaps not in other regions around the African continent. And one of the reasons was, the high literacy rate, for example, in Kenya, which I think is over 80%, So those dynamics or those nuances or those little details are something that I really appreciated about this book. And I think you'll also really enjoy that. That's why I say it's super informative. And she tries to run away from, this whole narrative of, Africa rising or Africa failing. She kind of tries to talk about a different concept, which is just Africa being. Why can't Africa just be? In all its nuance, all its complexity, all its diversity, why can't Africa just be, looked at not as a problem to solve, but just, why can't we just observe it? Let's have a more descriptive style rather than a prescriptive style for Africa. That's why I really find it amazing that she talked about that, because usually when you talk about African affairs, it's always how should we solve this? What's the solution? While it's a lot more complex than that. So I think that's something I really appreciated, that you know Kenya is at the center of this debate, and I think we have been crying out for that for the longest time, because we have always been the margins of this conversation. So I think that's a really powerful element about this book. Another very interesting element about the book, and something that Nanjala Nyabola points out, is the role of women, especially in the new public spheres that social media has presented to them, has empowered them. Kenya being a very patriarchal and misogynistic society where men dominate public spheres, and you can also just see by the numbers of women who are elected to public office, very few. But social media has given them a completely new platform to air out their grievances as well as empower them. There's so many movements on Twitter, for example, that have really elevated the voices of women who, in the normal public spheres or the traditional public spheres, be it in political rallies or be it in parliament, would have been marginalized. And I think the example that she used, and I think it was a very powerful example, was the hashtag that happened a couple of years ago that was called hashtag my dress, my choice. This was following a backlash where women who would go to town and who would be perceived to be wearing very short skirts, they would be undressed by men. I mean, that's kind of counterintuitive. Aren't you supposed to cover someone who you deem not well dressed? Anyway, but that's another story for another day. But essentially, what this did is, essentially, women came together and they created a hashtag and said, my dress, my choice. It doesn't matter what people think, matter what men think, especially about what I'm wearing. It's my dress, it's my choice. And of course, this created a massive debate, and there were many haggling, even from amongst women themselves. But I think, the way she encapsulated and described the movement and the way it developed was really powerful. And it's really amazing to see how social media has, elevated the voices of many, groups, not only women, in Kenya, that were perhaps previously marginalized. So I thought that was a pretty interesting element, or powerful element of the book that she looks at. And again, as I was saying, for her, in her personality as a Kenyan, she's able to be privy to the nitty-gritties and the dynamics of how it all played out. It was so refreshing. Not to say that people from other countries can't comment on this, but there was just some power in that, even for our own anecdotal experience, because she's also very active on Twitter. There are many activists and scholars and people and thought leaders on Twitter, on Facebook, who really are changing the social fabric and political discourse of Kenya. So I think it's really interesting that she points that out. So that's I think a very powerful element of this book. And I think finally, what she does very well, the final observation, is that she really has a balanced view of the dangers and the merits of technology in influencing our democracy and influencing our politics. And of course, the dangers, as you have seen and have been widely reported in the news, global news as well, is how is our data stored, now with all our, correspondence, all our, on Google Calendar, you have Google Calendar, you have Google Mail, you have Google Maps, how is all this data stored? And in Kenya, it's a very big question, because as much as we're the leaders, when you talk about Kenya, we talk about it as the Silicon Savannah, as a hub of technology and progress in the region. But this has made the government more, they want to do more surveillance around technology, around social media. And one dangerous thing as well is that now they're able to you know identify peoples by their ethnicity. And in Kenya, in recent months, we've had two big exercises, data collection exercises. One was the census, and the other one was something called Huduma number, which is essentially is a services card where you procure all your services as a Kenyan through a certain card, and all your information was collected. I remember them asking me questions during the census, such as, have you ever bought anything online? And I was like, okay, what? What type of question is, what does that have to do with anything? That sounds like a very market research question. And to be honest, I have a friend actually who told me that if they were a big company and they had access to a government and they're able to say, you can do market research for me through this census collection, this data collection, they'd be willing to sell it, and people have are willing to buy it as the company. So people have kind of said that the Kenyan government has been selling our information, and other governments have also been people have been saying that about other governments. So essentially, who handles our data? Who is responsible? Are there laws that regulate that? Unfortunately, in Kenya, as she points out, right now there is no running law that regulates how our data is protected, so we're very much at risk. So those are some of the dangers, even when you talk about ethnicity in Africa, when people have information that, there's X amount of, this ethnic group in a certain area, perhaps that information could be used for the wrong means, So there are many dangers around, our digital democracy, or having politics now played out in these spaces. But at the same time, I think the merits, as we have seen, giving agency to Africans and to other, parts of society that were previously marginalized. When you talk about women, when you talk about ethnic groups that are marginalized or not heard, they can amplify their voices using these platforms. And one interesting thing that she also remarks in the book is the fact that, in these platforms, the idea of ethnicity kind of almost, I wouldn't say disappear, but, you can come under one interest. Maybe you're interested in sport, or you're interested in politics, or you're interested in, this social media kind of facilitates that, sense of community and that type of thing. So those are some of the merits as well. Even in terms of fundraising, I think there was one, example in the book about a young man who was suffering from cancer, and how people kind of came together and helped him after his story was shared online. So I think she does a very good job of not prescribing a solution, or not saying it's so bad or so good. It's kind of, an idea of what is the situation, and let's have a more kind of nuanced and more detailed review of how, social media and the internet and technology is influencing our politics. And I think this book is a monumental book. I think it will now shape how we talk about democracy and technology, not only in Kenya, not only in Africa, but across the world. And I think it's such a wonderful addition to this debate. So tell me what you think about this book. Please get this book, read it. Very informative. I'm sure you'll learn something from it. And tell me what you think about it. Tell me your impressions. Please get engaged below. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of African Perspective. It's been a pleasure having you. See you next week.